My name is Dario Hasenstab. I'm here with Balder Hagratz, and we're back with the Western Bubble podcast. Today, we're talking about potential solutions to the Western Bubble. Hi, Balder. Why are we talking about potential solutions? How much have I been hyping it up over the past few weeks?
Hi, Dario. Well, way too much. Let's be clear about that. And I hope that people do not have very high expectations when it comes to us providing actual solutions, because that depends on so many different factors, which country you're talking about, um, with respect to which part of society, etc., etc. But we have been, for about 80 episodes, been very critical about this Western bubble idea that forms the foundation of this podcast, the idea that the West is in trouble, both internally as well as in its destructive behavior towards the rest of the world. And it is about time that we actually try to have a constructive, productive conversation about it. So, what kind of issues could actually be um, could lead to potential solutions? What kind of conversations do we need to have in society to actually strengthen again the, if you like, liberal democratic model, and to reduce our destructive behavior towards the rest of the world? And then you're thinking about issues such as sociological dynamics that we've been observing and criticizing, but also systemic institutional issues. How can we strengthen our political framework? How can we make sure that liberal democracy works for everyone, etc., etc.?
And that's exactly what we will be doing today, right? Is having one of those hopefully constructive conversations to decide, okay, if we want to save the West, how could we do it, right? What type of conversations would we need to have? But as I just teasered before, and this goes back to another thing we've said throughout the episodes, we need to have a conversation. Do we actually want to save the West? Is there something worth saving for us, right? So we need to do a little bit of a cost-benefit analysis of, does it make sense to save the West, or should we just start a new project elsewhere?
Yeah, the cliche there obviously is the quote by Churchill that the liberal democratic model is the worst of all potential models except for all the others, right? Um, i there is a lot of there are a lot of strengths in liberal democracy that are not visible in more authoritarian systems, and that haven't been visible in any historical civilization. So there are issues about liberal democracy as displayed by the West that are really, really powerful, and that deserve praise, right? That doesn't mean that everything needs to be praised, but the fact that you and I can have this podcast without any chance of repercussion, political repercussions, the police is not going to be knocking on our door if we criticize our political leadership or if we criticize powerful people within our society. That is a huge accomplishment by liberal democracy. So, yes, the answer is yes, liberal democracy is worth saving, despite the fact that there are a lot of things that are going in the wrong direction.
So this is what our conversation is, right? It's not about do we want to save the West as a whole. So because I was ready to talk about the culture, the architecture here, sitting in cafes in the sun, drinking coffee. We're talking about more the aspects of the West, right, with a capital W. And then here the central aspect is liberal democracy.
Yes, of course, we can't start analyzing, the value of a country like Spain or Germany compared to any other country. We're not interested in cultural comparisons. What we're interested in is this system that has been built up in the West over the past 300, 400 years. That started with the Enlightenment, well, arguably even before that, but French Enlightenment was the first serious effort to reform our way of thinking about politics, about leadership. That system that has then developed into what it is today, or what it was in the 1990s, that system is a very powerful and in many ways a very positive system that has a lot to be proud of. Western liberal democracy has accomplished egalitarian societies in ways that have not been seen anywhere else, not in recent history, but also not in other parts of the world throughout human history. The fact that liberal democracy led to this enormous technological change and improvements to our lives that are now being spread all around the world is an amazing accomplishment. The fact that we don't have evil dictators who just on a whim decide to kill someone or to take possessions away from individual citizens. All of those things are incredible, incredible accomplishments that are something that should be built upon. That doesn't mean that those are necessarily adequate or the correct approach for everyone around the world, right? But at least for Western Europe, for North America, they have worked very well over the past, let's say, 100 years, and they are worth preserving in some way or other.
Because I was going to say that China, and not necessarily using liberal democracy, is also experiencing great times of technological change, a lot of technological innovations that are also being spread around the world, right? So it's, as you said, this is not the way to go for everyone, and we should not be working actively on spreading it out to the world and make sure that everyone uses it, no matter what their opinion is. But that this is a conversation about what works for us within the Western world, and not a conversation what everyone else should be adapting to too.
Exactly that. And on top of that, it is important to realize that right now in the West, there's no formulation of an alternative, right? So the Western liberal system, democratic system, is something that has been built up over these past centuries. It is right now the dominant political mechanism that we have. And it's not as if anyone has put forward an alternative mechanism to choose from. So in that case, we better make sure that we improve and strengthen the system that we have until someone comes up, becomes famous, writes a book, comes up with an idea that could actually, be more attractive than what we have right now. We better work on making sure that the system currently works for the majority of its citizens.
But that's not happening either, right? Because we are not necessarily working on improving the current system that we have. It's more about managing the current system we have, right? Keeping the populists away from power, making sure that inflation is below 2% or that economic growth is happening above 2%.
And that is one of the main causes, as we have discussed, of this significant decline in society. So if you were to list the things that are good about liberal democracy, if you like, a ever improving mechanism that looks for ways to strengthen society. This internally critical system that tries to enhance those things that are good and tries to decrease or eliminate those things that don't work in society. That system probably reached perfection by the 1990s. Well, no, actually, I shouldn't say perfection. That reached its peak in the 1990s. It wasn't perfect in any way, but it reached its peak in the 1990s. And since then, we seem to have lost touch with that very fundamental mechanism that allows us to continue our ascent, continue our path towards utopia, and somehow we have now reached a plateau, and we're even falling off that plateau because we're no longer using the strengths of the system to our advantage. What we're doing is we're trying to keep it all together, make sure that it doesn't fall apart, and there's no vision of what's next. And that is the main problem of the 21st century. People are afraid, people are stressed. Politicians do no longer provide any narrative of what they want to achieve, and the result is us basically living on the coattails of previous generations.
And what is that mechanism that, right, as you described, that mechanism that continuously works on improving that liberal democratic model that we have stopped using? I mean, is it, because to me a mechanism sounds like a switch that we can turn around again?
Well, I would hope that there is a switch, right? I would hope that we can go back to what liberal democracy is at its core. And that what is it at its core? It's a system that has a natural legitimacy. It's naturally legitimate because people know and feel, at least in theory, that They are in control of their own society. There is not one royal family that decides everything. I mean, some liberal democracies still have royal families, but they have no longer have any of the political power that would basically invalidate the system. So there you go to vote, but it's not just that you go to vote, it's also that you know that the government is supposed to work for you. It's not supposed to work for anyone else but the citizens in general. You've got a system that is not afraid, does not shy away from criticizing leadership, punishing leadership for bad policy making through non-violent means, right? I mean, unless someone is corrupt, then they go to prison. But we can punish politicians for just doing a bad job by getting them out of office and getting a new politician in, new leadership. There is this automatic self-critical mechanism that should lead to continuous improvements to society. And that is not something that you would see in authoritarian systems, at least not in the same way. Even in the case that an authoritarian leader has a very progressive, very ambitious agenda for his or her country to take it into a utopia, then still that leader at some point will experience a decline. It will experience a lack of energy. Why? Because the system around that leader will cement itself and will start protecting its own interests versus the interest of the people. Liberal democracy doesn't have that. Liberal democracy doesn't create, at least theoretically, doesn't create that elite that will try to protect itself against citizens. It will renew itself over time, making it almost impossible for an elite to corrupt the system in any significant way.
Well, I don't know. Let me be the devil's advocate here, because I feel like that's the system and the world we're currently living in, right? That there's an elite, right? And when I'm talking about an elite, I'm not talking about a group of old white males sitting somewhere in a fancy club deciding on the world, right? But I'm talking about current policymakers. I'm talking about people within the media, but I'm also talking about people within the economy. And they are the ones who are currently managing society. And they are what we call the establishment, right? Who have become very comfortable with the power they have and hold, and who in some very personal cases are also not giving that power away. So for an example, Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, or Mitch McConnell, right? Who are pretty old and clinging on to power. And it seems to be very difficult for a new elite, a younger generation, maybe a new elite with different ideas, to actually come to the forefront. Because, again, what you've kind of been just describing here, I feel like about an authoritarian system has been happening here in the West, right?
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of those issues where one should never really talk in black and white in absolute terms. Obviously, there has never been a moment in history that there wasn't some kind of establishment, some kind of elite. And what you see, and you're absolutely right to point that out, that over the past, let's say, 25 years, the elite in the West has become more visible and more actively kind of undermining the system. So what I was talking about before is this idea that the system itself is anti-elite. Even if the elite might still exist, it tries to renew itself by not letting the elite take control of society. And you're absolutely right that now in the 21st century, there are signs that actually, because of economics, because of financing, because of globalization, and because of a lack of purpose, the liberal democracy no longer has that renewal, no longer has that refreshing of its leadership. And in many ways, those people that you mentioned that are of a certain age, as octogenarians ruling our society, are like a very stark example of that, right? But it's not just a matter of age, it's a matter of thinking, it's a matter of protecting your own old boys network, if you like. And that could also involve 30-year-olds. Being 30 doesn't mean that you're not part of that establishment, part of that elite. And that is exactly why we should be so worried, because on paper, in theory, liberal democracy has that renewal. In practice, lately, that renewal is no longer visible. and you see the elite taking over in a way that they shouldn't. And it's a different type of elite than before as well, which make things even worse.
And when you're talking about lately, we're talking about the last 30 years, right? Or 25. And obviously, in the first 10, 15 years, that never really shows because things are still going well, right? You're running off of the hard work of previous generations. But then that managerial attitude we've seen kind of, well, stagnate in that sense and take over more and more. And I would say since 2010, we've kind of been seeing at least stagnation, if not a slow downturn already, because that's the moment when income inequality really starts to spike. And then 10 years later, we're looking at COVID, we're looking at an energy crisis, we're looking at different wars and so on and so forth. We're looking at inflation. And now, right, 20 years later, you can clearly tell that the non-change over the last 30 years has really hit people where it hurts the most, and that's within their wallets.
Absolutely, and you mentioned 2010. I would maybe argue 2008 because the financial crisis that struck the world then was one created by a non-functioning system. It was one of the first very clear signs that the system was not looking out for its citizens. It was a systemic failure based on financial and political elites not controlling themselves, not being held accountable, not following their liberal democratic purpose, instead trying to cater to their own greed, etc., etc. So that was the first big sign that things were horribly wrong. And that was a very, very serious failure of the system. And since then, exactly as you said, you can see that systemic failure popping up much more frequently, with the unfortunate corollary that people then disconnect from the system and they feel betrayed by the system and they no longer try to actually improve it, right? They say, hey, the system is no longer working for me. I hate the system. I'm no longer going to be part of it. So what you see is that a lot of very intelligent, very capable young people no longer want to go into politics, no longer want to go into these kinds of roles that before were prestigious in a liberal democracy, because you wanted to make your country or your world a better place. Now they decide to go into different directions because there's no longer that trust in the system, which is very concerning. So then you see that political leadership just consists of a different breed of person, less capable, less intellectual, and much more, if you like, middle management.
Okay, yeah. With that last part, you basically have me on your side again because I was about to disagree. Because
Oh,
for
listeners love that if we disagree, Dario, because we apparently we agree way too often.
right, because when you said that now young people no longer want to go into politics, I almost stumbled. Right, I was full of my chair. Because I studied one of those degrees, right, where people do want to go into politics, international relations, and I saw way too many political science majors who said, "Oh, you know what? I have zero idea about the world. I just want to study political science, and then I want to go into politics." And I always sat there and thought to myself, yeah, "But wait a second, you." What are you going to do in politics? Are you going to manage things even more, right? And that's exactly what you said, is that you basically have a glorified set of middle managers. Because for me, if you, this is a very personal opinion, but the death to all politics is political science. Keep those people as far away from decision making as possible, please. Let them analyze it. Yes, they're very good at that. Let them analyze it and create their beautiful models, but keep them away from politics because they don't know how the world functions.
Well, I mean that might be another episode that we can record at some point, the sense and nonsense of political science. But what is very clear is that those people that you're referring to are people who see politics as a career, just like you would see middle management as a career. Whereas ideally, you want politicians to go into politics because they have a drive to actually change the world for the better, to improve the world. Changing doesn't mean destroying all the old and creating something completely new. Change could be just gradual improvements. Where can you strengthen society? Where can you make things better? Some kind of utopia that you want to work towards, even if utopia itself will never be reached. But those people no longer go into politics because their intellectualism is now repulsed by the political system. Middle management and intellectualism don't go well together.
Exactly. I would add here that at the age of 20, maybe a Mozart, right? 1 out of 1 billion has the intellectual capacity to say, you know what, I have a vision for the world and I want to take it somewhere. A lot of 20-year-olds will believe that they are exactly that person. Spoiler, you're not. I thought that about myself too. I'm not. But you actually need to maybe just circle around the sun a few times and actually get some experience and have some time of thinking and experience and just see what's going wrong for you to have a vision of what should be going right. I'm very skeptical when there's too many youngsters wanting to go to politics, right? All these, I mean, that's again, one of those things we have in common. We're not big fans of prime ministers or ministers being in their early 30s.
No, that's a little bit silly if you ask me. I mean, of course, there can always be the exception. There can always be the political Mozart that is just brilliant and understands everything there's there. But this tendency that you see in society of politicians becoming younger and younger has much more to do with image than with reality, right? So sometimes I make the joke, and it is really a joke because I don't really mean it, but really sometimes I say I want my leader, my country's leader, to be fat and drunk, right? And I don't mean that in a literal way because, being overweight is not good and being drunk is definitely not good. But what I mean to say is that our society now tends to be attracted to these young, kind of energetic people who actually look really good on paper, but don't have the intellectual and the experience, the intellectual ability and the experience to make the right decisions and to control the system around them. Now, you can see why, from a 21st century perspective, the establishment and the system likes young people. They're easy to influence. They're easy to basically mold into your own into your own image. And so if you are a lobbyist, if you represent big companies or large financial interests, then of course you want a 35-year-old prime minister because you can influence them in ways that you wouldn't be able to influence a 70 or 65-year-old in that sense, right? So yeah, this tendency to get younger politicians in is a bit silly.
We at some point have to do a deep dive on the former Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, right? Because he was exactly that person, young and slick, right? And everyone liked him because he could talk well. He had no scandals yet, right? Because
you're young, yeah.
He was a child, yeah. But at the same time, he became really, really corrupt, right? And so he's one of those reasons why I think we do have to be worried for liberal democracy at some point, because he directly attacked some of those things that we really, really enjoy about our systems, right? The balance of powers, a certain division between politics and media, right? You shouldn't really be paying off the media to get positive reports about you. I mean, there are still a lot of things to protect about liberal democracy, and those are some of them, right? Like a balance of power. Also, because I'm just thinking about that guy, right, Sebastian Kurz, a certain, right, there's less decadence within within elected officials than if you're elected for life, and unfortunately, Sebastian Kurz was everything but decadent.
It probably started, at least this conversation started with the Kennedy versus Nixon situation, right, where even now, if you were to ask people, what do you think of John F. Kennedy? People have a inflated perspective on him, right? People think of him as someone who was a really good president, who represented a new wave, etc., etc. Whereas if you look at the policies and the problems that were created by Kennedy as president in the few years that he was president before he was assassinated, are very significant. And he certainly at a foreign policy level, wasn't a very good president at all. But he was young, he was energetic, and that's why he was elected. Whereas Nixon was not as good looking, wasn't as charismatic, and he lost. Now, Nixon had his own problems with Watergate and everything else afterwards, so I'm not arguing that Nixon would have been a great president. But what is very interesting to see is that the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s were the era where this kind of started, because that was when TV became a thing, when it started influencing politics. The famous comparison of radio audiences preferred Nixon, whereas television audiences preferred Kennedy. That is when this started, and it's gotten worse and worse. And now, especially because we don't demand an intellectual discourse from leaders anymore, the only thing that matters is, hey, do you look good? Do you sound good? And are you young? And do you feel like fresh? Don't you have that background that you mentioned? Don't you have scandals behind you? As long as you hit those marks, you're gonna be all right. And so that means that someone like FDR, Roosevelt, or Churchill could probably never be elected anymore in today's world.
Well, I have right. We're talking about solutions. I have a solution for this. So you may have heard about this case study by the New York City Orchestra, right? They had a huge gender imbalance, and basically what they did to solve this is they started having their auditions, right? So they would basically be behind a curtain, and suddenly the gender imbalance changed. So my proposal here would be, let's just put a sack over the heads of politicians, or maybe have them only operate behind curtains, so we can no longer look at their appearance. Right? There's also this famous statistic that in U.S. elections always the taller person wins. Maybe that can all be solved by putting them just behind curtains or in big boxes.
That would be amazing. In the real world, I find this is one of those issues where I find it very hard to actually think of real solutions, right? Because we live also in the era of the internet, and these are not separate from each other, right? The fact that you have this managerial class at the same time that you have the rise of the internet, social media, and this enormous flow of information goes hand in hand. Because when you're looking for non-offensive, young, energetic-looking people, because those are the people you see continuously on the internet and on social media, then you bet you're going to get a bland bunch of leaders. Obviously, you're going to never elect someone who has something slightly negative in their past, right? Something that is a bit iffy or a bit dodgy, because the internet will expose it. And in some ways, and this is a conversation rather than me giving absolutes, but in some ways, you could argue that it was good that we didn't know everything about politicians, that we didn't have to be completely Puritan about them, and that if there were some skeletons in the closet, that was okay as long as they had a vision and they would be good leaders once they got to power. Now it's almost impossible to have skeletons in your closet, and therefore you're going to have a very hard time finding visionary, interesting, eloquent, intellectual leaders.
So you're talking about the likes of Donald Trump, right? Who have no skeletons in their closets, and they're eloquent and they have good visions, right? Because I think we have actually moved beyond the skeletons. Because how else do we explain the rise of Donald Trump, if not maybe through polarization, right? Which is actually one of those things that I'm not so sure. And again, we're still talking about whether we want to keep the West around in liberal democracy. I'm sick and tired of living in such a polarized world, right? No matter what you say, no matter what the issue is, always people are yelling at each other. Maybe it's nicer to live in an authoritarian system, right? Where someone just tells me what I have to think about that, but at least my neighbor is not yelling at me when I take out the trash.
Yeah, so when I was saying this, I actually had the name Trump flashing in my mind. And this is the problem of having a non-scripted podcast. If I wrote an essay about this, I would first have a paragraph putting Trump in a different corner, just like before I may have suggested that Churchill was a good leader, which is a whole different conversation. I guess there are these two different kinds of directions that you see, right? On the one hand, you want bland, non-offensive leaders because otherwise they will be cancelled before you know it. But because of this rupture of society, this enormous tribalism that you have, you can also make it if you go all in on the, if you like, on the extremism, right? If you go all in as Trump has gone, everything about the man is extreme. His lack of intellectualism is, that fits into this picture. Nobody expects a visionary discourse from him, and everyone understands that he's not an intellectual. So in that sense, he fits the normal mold. But on top of that, he has a million skeletons in his closet, both in terms of illegal activity, in terms of very dodgy behavior towards women, in terms of just having a very unpleasant narcissistic personality. But that is kind of okay in his case, because he has this army of supporters who see him as the anti-establishment candidate. So everything that the boring, bland establishment is, Trump is not. And that leads to the ability for someone like Trump to actually be politically successful. And you see something similar in certain European societies with Viktor Orban, or possibly Wilders in my own country, that people are so fed up with the liberal democratic establishment that they kind of like it when there is a candidate that just breaks all the rules, because breaking the rules is you signaling that you're not beholden to the failing political upper class.
I think one of the reasons why people are so fed up with this is, right, I mean, we already mentioned the managerial aspect. I think the second reason is that people are fed up with society moving very slowly, liberal democracy moving very slowly, and you have this, well, I was going to say good-looking populist, but it's usually not, right? It's usually the opposite. But you have this interesting-looking populist providing quick and supposedly easy solutions, whereas that's not necessarily what our system is about, right? Our system is very slow. I mean, I always like to talk about my work here a little bit, right? Where, I mean, there is a law that's being passed, then the ministry invites different stakeholders, right, for an event, talking, well, does this law actually work, right? What are all these different perspectives? Because you're taking every single perspective into account. There's an organization that, I don't know, represents the interest of frogs crossing a street, and then there's an organization that represents the interests of all handymen, and maybe an organization that represents the tile industry. And all of these different stakeholders have to basically be accommodated in law, and that doesn't really allow for big leaps, which we might need with the problems we're facing today. It's very slowly, but it respects all of these things that we've pointed out earlier that we like, right? Is that, I mean, there's not a lot of decadence. I mean, groups are protected, right? Nobody can really, like, you can't really make decisions at the cost of someone else. Power is balanced. It's just not a very sexy model, all of this democracy stuff we're talking about.
No, and in democracy, so if you were to list the good things about democracy, you're absolutely right. Efficiency or speed wouldn't be part of it. Absolutely not. And that's exactly why China can claim to have an alternative successful model, because they can do things way more effectively, way faster than would ever be possible in a liberal democracy. And yes, there is an interesting case to be made there, that in today's world where everything goes faster, and people no longer find comfort in their daily routines, right? There is this continuous pressure, this bombardment, if you like, of having to be successful, of, you see on social media all your friends swimming in the Bahamas and having fun, and you're just slaving away at your job. Whereas in the past, that was kind of an acceptable lifestyle. Now, because of these images from outside, it's no longer something that we feel comfortable with. And then all of a sudden, the weakness of the liberal democracy, the slow speed, is very clearly exposed. It also is a matter of us kind of prioritizing the wrong things in that sense, right? Like we very much in our society now care about our own circumstance, our own individual comparison with those around us, rather than saying we are, as a liberal society, working together towards something. So in many ways, that conversation about how can we as a society work together is now replaced by interest groups who want to go get ahead. And then liberal democracy doesn't work very well.
Not at all. At least domestically, we still have those processes, right? Where it's about balancing interests, making sure that everyone is taken into account. And if there is a decision made against a particular group, there are certain safeguards in place that will protect that group, right? So either we're talking about the courts, we're talking about their own interest groups and so on, which doesn't allow so much for kind of that tyranny of the majority. But that's another weakness of liberal democracy, and one that we've discussed at length with regards to the West, is when we talk about foreign policy, there is no other group, right, that can talk about their interests. They can talk about, well, if you drop this bomb in my country, Yemen, then people will die. That's not cool. Maybe we should take this to the courts. That doesn't happen on a foreign policy level, which is a big shortcoming of democracy, leading to them being so violent on the international stage.
That's exactly it, right? So if you were to list good things about democracy internally, it would be the protection of minorities, because you've got these systems that make sure that the majority cannot necessarily oppress the minority, which sets it apart from many authoritarian systems domestically. But then at a foreign policy level, exactly that. There is no mechanism to keep democracies from being aggressive towards the outside world. The only theoretical mechanism, which is where democratic peace theory goes, is, as a democracy, you prefer to trade with others. You don't like war because war is bad for your own purse, is bad for your ability to make money. But in reality, what we see is that making money is only one of the many factors that influence foreign policy, and that the fact that there is no defense mechanism against aggressive foreign policy making means that democracies are amongst the most destructive entities on the international stage, beyond any doubt, despite the fact that we like to think that China and others are the danger to global peace. Just statistically, democracies are much more war-mongering, much more jingoistic than any authoritarian system, with the exception of maybe Russia lately.
But then I have another solution, and it might be better than putting bags over people's faces. So if democracies don't attack other democracies, right, for the aforementioned reasons, then I think the solution to this could be just making every country in the world a democracy, and then we would have that solved, right? Because then everyone can represent their interests, and that would I think that could be a real thing, and it might be an objective to work towards too, right? For the West to make sure that everyone else out there is a democracy.
This is when on the internet you have /s, right, to indicate that this is the end of your sarcasm, because yeah. So this is exactly the problem where with democracies, not just over the past 25 years, but for all of their existence, they tell themselves that fairy tale, right? They tell themselves that story. We in the West, we are great because we're a democracy, and it is our holy duty to turn everyone democratic. And while doing that, we have a license to kill, essentially. We can bomb other places, we can violently engage in international politics because we are the good guys, and in the end, everyone's going to be like us. Well, that, of course, is a narrative that needs to stop. It is, first of all, nonsense, because, like as we said at the beginning of this episode, not everyone might actually be served by liberal democracy. In sub-Saharan Africa, you see increasingly narratives that reject liberal democracy as a possibility. So it is not a cure-all approach to humanity's challenges. And secondly, even if there was something to be said that liberal democracy could be universal and is objectively better than anything else, we have no mechanism to implement it. We have no mechanism to enforce it. And every time that we've tried to enforce it over the past, say, 70 years, it led to disaster, almost every time at least. Vietnam, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the list goes on.
I mean, and this goes back a little bit to the last episode that we recorded, where I'm always a bit defending the average Joe. I mean, it's really easy to buy that story, right? It's really easy to say, hey, I mean, right, we're just more peaceful. If every country out there was a democracy, we could just have one big United Nations, and we could have our little parliament and assembly. And, we just need to reform the UN Security Council because that's not democratic enough. But otherwise, I think we could do it.
Yeah, but reform it in a way that those countries that we don't like don't get a seat on the Security Council, right? That's important. Yeah. It is very, if you were to say, now I've actually had this conversation with people around me quite a lot. If I point out that Western Europe, specifically countries like the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and then the United States, are responsible for by far the largest number of civilian casualties in war, in violence over the past 50 years. And that is just statistically true, right? I mean, the Netherlands and the UK and the United States, and to a lesser degree France and some others, have killed way more civilians than any other nation on earth. And certainly have killed way more civilians than China, for example, because China doesn't kill civilians abroad. You can talk about their internal politics, but internationally, China, at least in the 21st century, hasn't invaded anyone, hasn't bombed anyone outside of Chinese borders. If I point that out to people, people say, oh, but you can't compare these things because China is China. And then you get into this really weird conversation, like as if the fact that China is authoritarian negates the fact that they are not destructive on the international stage, that they don't kill people outside of their own borders. As if it's a little bit the comparison is you have two neighbors and one you believe to be a little bit of a psychopath, but you never hear from him, you never see him, he never appears, never does anything, but you believe he's a psychopath and he gives you the creeps. That is our perspective on China. And then on the other side, you've got a neighbor who you think is a great guy, is amazing, but once in a while gets drunk and starts shooting people in the garden. Well, then you say, okay, but he's a great guy, and the fact that he once in a while kills a passerby, that's okay because he's still a great guy. But the psychopath on the other side, they are the ones that we have to be careful of. Well, that's not really a fair assessment of what we should be doing, right?
Walter, we're not making a strong case for saving the West right now. I mean, okay, we've identified a few elements that we really like, right? Balance of power, I mean, less decadence, balancing of interest, right?
Protection of minorities.
Yeah. Exactly, right? So there are a few cases, but we've also identified a lot of basically areas that need improvement. And I would say that now we basically move over to that. So let's talk about a little bit what actually needs saving here. Like, what are the areas that we need to improve on if, and we do, want to save the West?
Well, if we want to do that, if we want to look at actual ways to strengthen our societies, then we probably can divide it into three different areas. We probably have to look at the sociological behavior of our society, the psychology of individuals within it, because liberal democracy is not just about the rules that exist, but it's very much about the sort of unspoken legitimacy that you can't contractually oblige people to follow, but that exists as a hidden force within that society. So that's one aspect. Like, how do we as Western liberal populations look at ourselves and our countries? Then you of course can have loads of really productive and constructive conversations about the system, about how to strengthen politics, how to make sure that elections are fairer, how to make sure that politicians behave more in line with our liberal democratic goals. And then hopefully out of that comes better policy making, right? So we can also have a conversation about what type of policies are conducive towards a healthy, strong liberal democratic society, and what kind of policies actually go against that goal.
And so you started on the individual level, I would say, right? I mean, I like to think that this conversation that we've been having for quite some time now is a bit of a start to this, right? As that it's not only about analyzing your problems, although this is the first step, but also saying, okay, how can we actually move forward, and how can we save the West? And I mean, but I think the first step here is kind of how do we save democracy? And the most basic form of this is, as you said, is a certain level of equality, almost of fairness, right? That, I mean, hey, protection of minorities is ultimately not ultimately, yes, it's about the protection of minorities, but it is about fairness, right? It's making sure that the majority doesn't rule over the minority. And this goes back to all elements of democracy.
Yeah, and that fairness has to, exactly what you're saying, it has to apply to everyone. So the whole point is that you, as one person within a liberal democratic society, have a vested interest in making sure that you're not just being treated fairly in the sense of economic fairness or psychological fairness or moral fairness, but also that your neighbor is treated fairly. Because if your neighbor is not treated fairly, then the whole system eventually will collapse. And that kind of sense of fairness is something that we have forgotten about. What you see very much is that people demand fairness, if you like, towards themselves. I don't know if you can even say that. Is it possible for fairness only to apply to you, right? But people demand respect. People demand that they're being listened to, that they have a voice. But they don't really seem to understand that they also have to demand that for their rivals, for the people they disagree with, for the people who might even be insulting them, right? Someone insulting you doesn't mean that that person all of a sudden needs to be cancelled out and eradicated from society.
See, I think this is a very good kind of starting point, because obviously there are certain groups within our societies that have been treated pretty unfairly for a very long time, right? So, I mean, we're talking about institutional sexism, racism, homophobia, and these are groups that I would say we've made a lot of progress, right, to kind of include them and to treat them more fairly. And so these groups, I mean, right, it's a bit difficult to say this as a white Western European, right? So they have been demanding fairness, rightfully so, for a very long time for themselves, right? And I think we're now in a time where each group is only demanding fairness for themselves, right? Kind of saying that, oh, me and my individual group, we deserve or demand more fairness, but that we have somehow forgotten within society to kind of look a little bit further and say, well, but this group also demands fairness. So I'm willing to speak out on behalf of fairness for every single group of society, because that's what ultimately kind of makes or breaks democracy, right? And as soon as one group then feels like, oh, we're losing out on the fairness a little bit, that's when you see kind of this lashing out that I would say we see within that, right, uneducated white male part of the population that feel like that all this fairness has come at my cost lately. And then there are some legitimate concerns of those populations that maybe have not been fought for by anyone else except that white group, right? And I think that's maybe the problem that we've been running into in the past few years, is that every group is fighting for their own fairness, but we're not thinking about fairness overall.
Yeah, and it's in many ways almost delusional, how we have taken the wrong lessons from the civil rights movement, or if you like, women's emancipation, right? So here there was a look at the United States in the 1940s, 1950s. You have institutionalized segregation, institutionalized deep racism, also still very deep patriarchal sexist structures that are objectively putting one group, white middle class men, um, in front of everyone else. And they rule society, and everyone else but basically is trying to somehow desperately survive within that structure. Now, then you have the civil rights movement that restores some balance. And now we look back at that and we say, oh, I'm not going to see that as restoring balance to society, but I'm going to perceive that as a group that by fighting for their rights, they got what they wanted. Rather than a group, Martin Luther King and many others, who actually fought for a broadly fair society, right? This wasn't just, it wasn't just about institutional racism, it was about creating a better liberal democracy at the time. And yet we've forgotten about that. We're now looking at that and say, look, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and all these others, they fought for their position in society. So my group now has to fight for our position in society, without understanding that there are substantial differences between you in 2024 and African Americans in the 1950s, 1960s. It seems as if the lessons we take is fight for yourself rather than fight for fairer, broad, structural, societal dynamics.
And this then leads to groups fighting each other, right? Kind of saying, oh, your fairness comes at the cost of my fairness. And that leads to this incredible level of aggression we've seen towards each other in society, right? I mean, it's I don't like this term, oh, we're living in such a polarized world, because we are, right? I mean, you're almost kind of getting tired of that, of always hearing we're living in a polarized world, but we are. There seems to be no 2 or 3 groups that can agree on something anymore.
Right, because this goes hand in hand with a change in the way we perceive our own identity, right? Rather than seeing ourselves as individual citizens within a broad liberal democratic framework, we now see ourselves as very specifically belonging to groups. And our group is different from another group, and now we perceive our duty as protecting the strength of our tribe, our group versus those others. And you get these crazy kinds of dynamics, like even, the white men who now believe somehow against all all the facts that are out there and all the objective reality that is out there, that they're being attacked and that they're being oppressed. The Jordan Petersons, the Andrew Tates, all those people who basically say, young men, arm yourself because society is turning against you. Rather than saying, hey, young men, do something to make liberal democracy better. Don't worry about your own group's identity. You're not Martin Luther King. You're not an African American in the 1950s. You're a white 20-year-old man, and you have all the opportunities that everyone else has. But it is up to all of us to make sure that liberal democracy strengthens and gets better. That conversation no longer seems to exist. It's all about how can I defend my tribe against the other tribe. And some tribes have a slightly stronger claim to being treated unfairly than others. There is still racism in our society. There is still sexism in our society. There's still work to do there. But that should never lead to a situation where it becomes about identity politics, where it becomes about one group that call themselves, let's say, feminist versus another group that call themselves incels. And those are now going to fight, and those are going to try to see who wins that fight. That is completely misunderstanding what liberal democracy is supposed to be about. Liberal democracy is about creating a fair society for everyone, and then within that fair society, you can have a ideological framework that you want to convince others of. And politically, sometimes you will get how you believe ideologically society should function, and other times you won't. That's how liberal democracy works. Rather than this entire existence based on you being a small part of a small group within a society that is supposedly hostile against your group or hostile against you. It's something went horribly awry in that sense. Something went horribly wrong over the past 25 years in the way that we feel threatened by liberal democracy around us.
Here I want to highlight one of the positive examples, and I mean, I might be a bit biased here because I personally feel a bit closer connected to that group, but the traditional feminists, right, who've always been basically striving for equality and always still use their platforms to also highlight, problems within other groups. And the example here is usually the one, right, about the unusual high rate of suicide amongst men. Right? So you kind of have this Movember movement, right, in November every year. And so here you have a group that has a very clear purpose, right, to fight for equality for women, but then doesn't forget within this fight to say, hey, right, all these topics that we're covering still super important in our main identity. But look at this right here. This group is also struggling a little bit, and we might want to do something to address these causes, because we can not only address our own causes, because it transcends it, right? That kind of feeling of citizenship.
And that's a great example, because so this is what sets them apart from, if you like, post-feminists or neo-feminists, whatever you want to call them. But traditional feminism is, by definition, about the whole of society. It claims, and very forcefully and convincingly so, that patriarchy hurts the entire society. It's not just that women are oppressed. Yes, women have been oppressed by patriarchy, and to some extent still are, but also men have to follow these patriarchal structures, have to follow these behavioral patterns that they're forced into, right? Men are not supposed to cry. Men are not supposed to show emotions. Men are supposed to be the protectors of the family, whatever that means. And feminism has very effectively shown that that is not the way to create a fair, prosperous society. In the same way, again, that Martin Luther King and other African American leaders very forcefully made the case that white America would actually do better if you don't have segregation. That this is not some kind of thing of white versus black, that this is a thing about how to create the fairest possible, most liberal democratic society. Um, these traditional movements, and we're now talking about the 20th century especially, have somehow been hijacked or kidnapped in the 21st century by groups that take completely the wrong lessons from this and that just believe that as long as you get your message out, as long as you have enough pro-Palestine flags or pro-Israel flags or pro-Ukraine flags or whatever it is, then you're gonna somehow win. But nobody asks themselves, well, what does this mean, winning? If society collapses, your tribe might win the battle, but everyone will lose the war eventually, right?
Well, it's almost like we need more purpose-driven movements that, based on that purpose, develop an ideology, right? And here we're talking about the traditional ideology, right? Not the modern day term ideology that has become a bit of a taboo word, but purpose-driven traditional movements that say, hey, our purpose is to improve society as a whole, and we're looking at this through this lens, through patriarchy is harmful to society, and by the changes that we want to make, particularly for the group that we're representing, we're going to better the life of everyone in society.
So, and the lack of that purpose that we are seeing right now in our modern society, and sort of the lack of understanding that we need to keep on building on our liberal democracy, right? So I think the problem is that this generation and the previous generation of young people, so my generation sort of, we grew up in such comfort with liberal democracy that we sort of take it for granted and we don't have any more as a purpose to strengthen it. It's there and we kind of vaguely assume that it will always somehow be there. And now within that comfort, it is up to us to defend our own interest. And that leads to a lack of purpose for the whole society. So having a narrative about what actually could we still do as a society broadly to make our world more fair, more equitable, just generally happier, higher levels of well-being. Those are not easy conversations, right? It's not an easy checklist, like how do you achieve that? But at least to have a conversation about where do we want to end up? What would be success in the next 50 years? What could we be proud of? If we look at 2024 and we look at, let's say, 2074, in the next 50 years, what can we reasonably achieve that we can say, hey, we did well and we improved our society on what we had? Those kinds of conversations are completely gone. And again, I think that's very much related to this identity politics and this idea of, because we no longer have that purpose, we are just inward looking and we are continuously afraid to be attacked by others or to be disrespected. If we have something important to do, if we have that purpose in mind, then we are less fragile about our own ego and about our own identity, right? And that's something that you see in non-democratic societies very often. So the Chinese population are much less fragile about being disrespected because they have a higher purpose. They're working towards a better tomorrow for China, for the Chinese, and they see themselves as part of that communal dynamic. And we have completely lost that, and we just see ourselves as scared individuals who are continuously hurt by others around us.
I mean, those are these, I know that term might be controversial by now, but those are these first world problems, right? It's as soon as you've reached a basic level of well-being in economic terms, you can suddenly start thinking about all these problems that I don't know, that might hurt your feelings or that might annoy you in another way, shape, or form.
And that is related to all these concepts that have been popping up over the past 20 years: wokeness, cancel culture, political correctness. If no one has to explain to me that it's important to be kind to others. Please be kind, please be nice, please be friendly, especially in your own daily lives, right? Don't write about what a wonderful person you are, but just when you go walk down the street, be nice to the person next to you, be nice to the shopkeeper, be nice to your colleagues. Those things, really, really important. And I think that we should have many, many more conversations about basic decency and kindness. But for heaven's sake, let's not be so incredibly desperate to all the time be treated with kid gloves, with with velvet gloves. And if someone at some point says something that's not very nice, move on. Sometimes people are in a bad mood. Sometimes people are just not very friendly people. It's not the end of the world. There are bigger fish to fry in life, right? We're so fragile at the moment. And so the moment that someone does something that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, it will be my life's mission to cancel them, to get them fired from their job, or to get them arrested by the police, or whatever it is. And we have completely lost the plot in that sense.
This is addressing the internal aggression within Western societies, so us fighting with each other all day long. It seems like the only topic that our societies can agree on nowadays are the evil outsiders, right? Because it's always a bit easier, right? You're basically saying, well, we're all at each other's throats right now, but, if the evil Chinese send their fleet our way, that will be difficult. And that's this external aggression that we still need to address, right? The terrible rhetoric that leads to incredibly destructive foreign policy by Western countries, Western nations on the global scene,
which is very closely related to this lack of purpose, right? Because we've got a very practical and real example of this. When Joe Biden got elected president in 2020, in 2021, essentially his first big foreign policy initiative was to start a Cold War with China. This was before the Ukraine war. He voluntarily said, the White House said, we're gonna up the ante against Beijing. And why do you do that? Because if you find it difficult to formulate what you want to achieve as the United States, or as president of the United States, then the only way to give some kind of purpose, at least a sense of direction, is to fight the other. But here's the problem. You don't really have any existential enemies if you're the United States, so you have to make them up. So you make up China as this enormously dangerous, evil existential threat. And now you have at least a short to medium term goal, namely limiting the reach of China, trying to make sure that China doesn't grow faster than you. It becomes some kind of weird realist game, completely devoid of any introspective dynamics of what do we as Americans need and how can we make sure that in 2074 the United States is a better country than it is today, right? This othering in foreign policy, this creation of enemies outside and very aggressively hunting them down, is a very clear sign of a society that lacks internal purpose, internal inspiration.
The example here, or the real life example, would be the one of a wounded wild animal that's in a corner, right? It's cornered by some attackers, alleged attackers. I might want to add for the sake of this example, and it's lashing out, right? Because it's hurt. It's deeply hurt. I don't know, like maybe it broke its paw, and it can't hear very well anymore, and now it's lashing out towards the outsiders because it feels like it needs to, because it's being attacked constantly.
Yeah, and so whenever it sees a chance to do that, it will do that. And that's also one of the reasons why the West has been, on the one hand, so kind of blindly going into the Ukraine-Russia thing. Like, hey, here's an obvious case where we can once again create the other. We have a clear objective enemy. Now, I would argue that Russia did things wrong that China never did, right? So the China example is more blatantly artificial than the Russia example, because Russia did invade Ukraine without any legitimacy or international support. But the West jumped at that, at the opportunity to say, hey, we are with Ukraine because this gives us once again some kind of foreign policy purpose. We have something to do. We can feel good about ourselves. We're on the side of liberal, free, democratic countries against evil authoritarian regimes. But nobody actually can formulate what it is that we're trying to achieve with Ukraine, Russia. Nobody can say, oh, this is the actual goal, and this would be success. 10 years down the line, we would be happy with this achievement, with this result. Nobody's doing that. So intuitively, we need something to give ourselves identity, but we have no intellectual basis for that whatsoever.
So it goes back to this element of finding or having purpose. I mean, I'm pretty sure now a bunch of Western policymakers will jump up and say, oh, wait a minute, I know exactly what I want the world to look like in 10 years. It's that the borders of Ukraine from 2013 are back in place. Putin is basically removed from office because he's an evil guy. And that's it, right? But not, I mean, when we're talking about purpose, we're talking about maybe we require a new security architecture for Europe, Asia, right? A security architecture in which every country feels safe. That's something that purpose would be, while the borders of 2013 and Putin being in jail, that's not necessarily a purpose-driven
No,
conversation.
so those sort of fake objectives that you mention are first of all not realistic, right? Not achievable. There's also something very dark about them because the West is pushing for that without actually sacrificing much. Yeah, they're spending money on it, but it's the Ukrainians and the Russians, but in this case specifically the Ukrainians who are dying. The Ukrainians who notice the destruction and they become a weird toy in this psychological game that the West is playing with itself. And you're absolutely right. The real conversations would be about, okay, so in the 1990s, we thought we knew what the world was going to look like. It's obvious that we were wrong. Now, in 2024, how can we create some kind of global infrastructure that makes the world a better place? And that's not going to be perfectly just representative of us because we can't just force other countries to be like us. We've tried it and it didn't work. But how can we create an infrastructure that uses the UN, that uses the World Trade Organization, that uses all those organizations in a productive, positive way forward, where we respect the individual worldwide and we respect our own identity as a liberal democracy. But that conversation doesn't exist. It's all about, oh no, China is becoming slightly more powerful in the World Health Organization. Problems. Well, yeah, because they've got 1.4 billion people and the second largest economy in the world. Of course they're going to be more influential. It would be terrible if they didn't. But those debates, those conversations are not being had.
Not at all. At least I'm not aware of them. Maybe they are being held in secret rooms, and I'm not aware. But this kind of goes back to the conversations the West needs to have internally, right, about strengthening itself from the inside. Because, and this is a reoccurring element from the last 80 plus episodes, is that the West rose to international power through inner strength. Right? Oh, wow, it sounds very spiritual what I'm talking about right now. But right, through inner strength, knowing who you are, knowing, working on your system, and then internationally, everyone looked at the West and said, "Well, this is a successful model, might be worth copying." Right, and then at some point, the West kind of had a turning point, and we've talked about this extensively in the past as well, of no longer looking at the inside, only looking at the outside and saying that, well, you should copy our model because we are already convinced that it's amazing. You're kind of eyeing our model, liking it, so you should really adopt it. We're going to do everything so that you adopt it. Right? Kind of missing the way here, missing the path here, and lacking the purpose.
Yeah, the best way for you to spread the word, if you like, is be successful internally, because then externally you will have a tool at your disposal. You can say, look at us, why wouldn't you want to at least listen to us? Because clearly there's something that we're doing right. Now, just to make sure that nobody's confused about this, of course, during those past 80 years, there were also a lot of dark aspects of Western foreign policy outside, right? So the West was, over the past 300 years, the West has been incredibly successful, but of course it also has done that by doing some pretty horrific things towards the rest of the world. Neocolonialism, colonialism, messing around with Latin American democracies, etc., Vietnam, etc., etc. So the way you want to go about it is say, what are the core aspects that make us strong internally, and how can we learn from our very serious mistakes from the past, so that now we continue to grow and we continue to be happy with ourselves, and the rest of society will look, the rest of global society will look at that and think, oh, maybe I don't want to exactly copy what Spain has, but I certainly am happy to work together with Spain and maybe learn from Spain, right? That basic idea, that basic concept of you being influential, not because you desperately want to be influential, but because you are somehow being respected by the rest of the world. That has to come back to liberal democracy. And we seem to have completely forgotten about that.
And I would say that one of the things that the West is still admired for globally is the strong institutions we're working with. And I think that could be a great starting point for an internal discussion, right? Is instead of talking about, oh, how can we, I don't know, weaken the Supreme Court in the United States to make it more equal again? How can we, I don't know, undermine Parliament? Maybe we should start having conversations again how we can strengthen the Supreme Court in a way that is contrary to what the Supreme Court is doing to itself right now, right? We've discussed this in 2 episodes ago. And so these are conversations that we should be having again, is what's the role of the Supreme Court and how can we make sure that this role remains that way?
And that conversation is very closely linked to the conversation we just had, namely, you need a strong, ever improving institutional framework together with a sense within the population that we are all citizens within a fair and equitable social structure. And then you have a very powerful system in place, a system that can manage to, it can achieve amazing things, as it has achieved amazing things for Western populations over the past couple of 100 years. So these kinds of institutional conversations, the Supreme Court, so one of the founding principles of liberal democracy is that there's a balance of power. We talked about that at the beginning of this episode, this idea that you do not have a small group of people who can essentially do whatever they like without a counterbalance. So that if they want to achieve something, they can only do so through dialogue and through broad consensus, otherwise they can't. They can't push through a own niche, narrow agenda. And yet, what you see now in the United States Supreme Court is that that's exactly what they're doing. They're basically giving immunity to the president, and they're giving themselves immunity from corruption charges, etc., etc. So if we want to go back to a better functioning of such a Supreme Court, which is fundamental for liberal democracy more broadly, we need to ask ourselves, how did we get here? How did the United States get to this situation that Supreme Court is basically a political piñata? And how can we make it independent, legally focused on legalities, on justice rather than politics, etc., etc.? And then you kind of have to start saying, okay, this starts with at the political level, right? There's something that's gone horribly awry with political parties, almost symmetrically to what we said about individuals. Political parties should, at the core, have a purpose that is higher than themselves. The purpose is to make sure that liberal democracy, the system, functions. And as long as the system is functioning, then you can fight for your own political agenda. But instead, it seems that nobody cares anymore about a well-functioning system, and it's all about winning the day, right? Winning your own political fight. And that has led to this situation with the US Supreme Court.
I mean, it almost seems like the purpose of parties right now is to fight someone else's agenda, right? It's no longer putting forward great ideas and saying, oh, this is how we're going to achieve that goal, right? The purpose that we found. It's more about something else that we've addressed at the beginning of this episode, kind of managing the economy, managing inflation, and managing, most importantly, that the other person is not going to get power. That's the most important thing we need to manage, right? I mean, parties have really just become a joke, let's be honest.
The defeat the other side, try to make sure that you win against the others, very much like what we said about groups within society. So that lack of respect for the fact that, yes, of course, you can have your own ideological convictions, and of course, you can fight for them in the sense of intellectually put your ideas forward and see if you can get broad consensus, broad support for it. Of course, that's there. But that complete loss of understanding that there is something higher, that there is a higher goal that will supersede any narrow political agenda, is one of the great tragedies of the 21st century. And this is noticeable in issues such as, for example, corruption within political parties, right? So here in Spain, for example, over the past 10 years, there have been very serious corruption cases against both political parties, but especially against the PP. That was really, before anyone gets upset with me, I'm aware that PSOE and other political parties also had issues, but there was a very, very significant, proven, with convictions and all that, corruption case against high-ranking PP members. And instead of saying, as a PP, Partido Popular member, oh, this is awful, and for the next year, I'm going to make it my life's work to eradicate all of this terrible corruption from my own tribe, PP basically banded together and said, no. We are just being attacked by the others, and we will close ranks, and we will defend ourselves, and we will make sure that we will not be hurt by the other tribe, completely misunderstanding the purpose of why you have a political party in the first place.
See, what just happened here is so indicative of the problem that you've just described, because your immediate reflex was, oh, before you get mad at me, hey, of course, I'm aware that PSOE is doing the same, because you are already anticipating that anyone who, let's say, holds it with the Conservative Party in Spain, their immediate reaction would be, yeah, but PSOE too. Instead of saying, oh, yeah, I cannot believe it, that my own tribe, that they were being corrupt. How dare they, right? The immediate reactions, but the other one too. Honestly, it's a little like, for you personally, it should be worse what your own tribe is doing. If two parties are doing the same and your party is doing that, then you should be more upset with your own party.
That's exactly it. What do you care about the other party for a moment? Of course, later on you can argue with the other party again. And if you notice that the other party engages in corruption, it's perfectly fine to call that out. But as long as there's any corruption in your party, that should be your priority number 1, 2, 3, 4 until 10. Because there you are responsible. There you can do something about it. You should be much more outraged about your own friends and colleagues doing horrible things than some kind of random stranger down the street. Instead, we are so beholden to our own tribal identity politics that we find it very, very difficult to deal with that. And this is visible at every level, right? I wish, as we often have ranted about environmentalists doing stupid things with art, throwing oil and jam and other things at art pieces. I wish that the environmental movement would say, we can't accept this. This is not us. We stand for the environment. We are not against art, so we are going to make sure that we clean our own house before we do anything else. The same with all those kinds of mechanisms, right? But because we no longer have that higher purpose of liberal democracy in mind, the only thing that matters, the highest that we have to achieve, is the strength of our own tribe. And so anything that can damage our own tribe is a problem. And this leads to political parties, both Democrat and Republican, but especially Republican lately, voting in very radical and kind of anti-intellectual judges and also Supreme Court justices throughout the country, right? Because the Supreme Court is like the most visible issue here. But throughout the country, there are these layers of judges that have been elected not because of their legal expertise, but because of their political affiliation, their loyalty towards the tribe, completely undermining what American democracy should be about. So if we want to change that, if we want to improve that, we need to have conversations about that. And if you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, don't worry so much about the other party. Worry about your own party and demand from your own party that they install the right kind of justices. Demand from your own party that they're free from corruption. Work on that. Don't keep on yelling at the other.
So once we've found the purpose, right? And again, we can have a conversation about what the purpose should be. We've had that conversation just before, and we came to the conclusion that our purpose should be to strengthen liberal democracy. Then we have the conversations about how do we do this? Well, we want to strengthen institutions, right? The courts, political parties, how we talk to each other, right? Conversations within society, making sure that we're striving for a fair and just democracy. Then we can move on to the policies, right? Because after that very tedious, very long process, ideally comes out good policy. And on the internal level, that should be these policies then should be in line with all the goals that we have laid out before. And the main thing here is to make sure that in society we're living at a bit more of a fairer level, because let's be honest, the last 15 years have not been good. People are genuinely struggling.
Yes, absolutely. Give me 10 seconds to mention something in between, and then I will talk about that, because what you just said is, of course, absolutely fundamental. But these conversations about institutions then led to, they don't have to be tedious. They can be really intellectually interesting, right? They can be about what do we demand from ministers and prime ministers? How do we want the relationship between politics and legal structures? What is the relationship between national governments and local governments? These are really important conversations to have, and really interesting, and something that can always be improved, right? So there are loads of very specific practical conversations that can be had in order to improve our society. If only we would forget about our own tribalism and our own identity being continuously under siege, or whatever it is that we feel. I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, some say so, others say so. I mean, I think you're convinced that these are very interesting conversations to have. Right, they are. I still think that they will be very tedious, because it requires a very robust process where you need to talk to a lot of people that you will disagree with, and that can be tedious.
I get that, but I mean, we can build on thousands of years of literature on governance and debates on governments, even going back to the old Romans and the old Egyptians. There's so much interesting conversations to be had, right? But yeah, okay, it depends on what you find interesting. There are lots of things I find interesting that, might set me apart from many others. Okay, fair enough. But you absolutely mentioned something crucial. So this goes back to the beginning of today's conversation again, namely that the whole reason why liberal democracy works, and why we do want to defend it, and why we should try to strengthen it, save it from the current decay, is that there is inherent legitimacy within liberal democracy. There is an inherent sense that everyone somehow is represented by liberal democracy. And that doesn't mean that you're always going to get what you want. Sometimes your preferred political party makes the decisions, and sometimes it doesn't. That's perfectly fine. Also at an individual level, sometimes a judge goes against you, sometimes they go with you. But overall, there's a consensus that society works for each citizen at a relatively fair, equitable level. And if you look at domestic policy making over the past 25 years or so, this seems to have been completely forgotten. There are groups that are now being forgotten by the system, being abandoned by the system, groups that live in absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is back in Europe, right? Where we had eradicated it by the late 20th century, mostly in terms of people going hungry, people not being able to buy food for their children, things like that. Now that's absolutely back. Food banks are in high demand. Even in a country like the Netherlands, hundreds of thousands of people on a population of 17 to 18 million make use of food banks. In the UK, this is even worse. People are no longer capable of effectively competing on the job market because they don't have the right education. Healthcare is going down, certainly in the UK. There's this horrible statistic of poor children in the UK being 1 centimeter shorter now in 2024 than a decade ago, which is a huge indictment of policymaking going wrong. How can it be that in our modern society, new generations are shorter, physically shorter, than previous generations? That means that healthcare-wise, lifestyle-wise, opportunity-wise, something is going terribly, terribly wrong. And even if you say, I find it difficult to care about them because it's probably their parents who should have worked harder, or whatever stupid narrative you have to explain this, you will have to recognize that the society that you are benefiting from, the liberal democratic society, will not survive this if this goes on for very long, because it undermines that very essential legitimacy that liberal democracies are supposed to have. So you don't have to be a hardcore socialist or communist in order to understand that if policies lead to deprivation and lead to groups within society being abandoned by the system, that then in the end the whole system will collapse. The whole purpose of liberal democracy disappears.
So here we need to focus on policies that will alleviate basically those worries and those sorrows. And I think, again, internally, I think those are going to be some very intense discussions because there are clear ideological differences on how to achieve this. However, I think it's a bit easier externally, right? Because, I mean, as we've discussed, the lack of purpose, the weakening of institutions also leads to bad policy internationally, particularly bad foreign policy. And here, I mean, I would say, again, I'm saying this is easy. It might not be easy, but I think if we just stop meddling in other countries' elections, we stop bombing places, I think those are rather black and white policies that we can follow that, again, I'm sorry for using the term, but are rather easy to implement.
And it sounds very simple, right? Let's stop bombing places. And then people say, oh yeah, but that's so overly simplistic. But actually it isn't, because at least 170 countries, I haven't counted them exactly, but at least 170 countries out of, let's say, 193 countries are not active militarily across the globe. It is only a very specific group of mostly Western countries and Russia that are actively engaged in bombing other places, in military foreign policy. And there is no real intellectual foundation for that anymore. You can't defend it intellectually anymore. There was this sense in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, especially, that the United States had some kind of police function in the world, which was a horrible concept and never quite worked anyway, but at least there was some kind of thinking about it. But nobody in their right mind in 2024 thinks of the United States as the policeman of the world. That would be insane. And so not bombing places, not killing civilians in other countries, in countries that haven't attacked you, seems like such a basic thing to do or not to do, right? And yet some governments, the United States, the UK, the Netherlands, and a number of others, seem to be incapable of understanding this. And all the time they go back to their military might and their military machine, and all the time they create further anguish and further destruction around the globe, weakening the West's position in the long term. Because believe me, the rest of the world doesn't enjoy seeing their own children and their own civilians being killed by foreign powers. The Netherlands has bombed in Libya, or at least facilitated violence in Libya, facilitated violence in Mali, bombed in Syria, bombed in Iraq, bombed in Afghanistan, and now is actively participating in violence in Yemen. And none of these countries that I just mentioned ever attacked the Netherlands in any way, shape, or form. So the fact that the Netherlands is so comfortable with this means something about our distorted, kind of twisted mindset. And we have to get rid of it, because this type of foreign policy will usher in the end of any kind of status or prestige that the West might still have somewhere in the world.
So apart from these, again, in my opinion, easy steps, of not bombing other places, what's next?
Well, the big issue that kind of is the answer to all these topics that we've just discussed is that politics needs to once again engage with the reality that people experience. So one of the reasons, as we have mentioned, that the populist right has so much success, the Le Pens of this world, the Trumps of this world, in my own country, Wilders, is because they're the only ones who at least seem to say anything, right? The establishment don't have practical answers because they're afraid to offend. They are afraid to say anything that might somehow turn away voters. And as a result, by being bland, with the establishment not actually providing any kind of discourse or narrative about where we want to go, about purpose, they're basically pushing voters towards the extremes because that's the only place where someone seems to care about them, right? Where someone still has some kind of interest in changing things, even though certainly right-wing populism is a destructive way of changing things. Fortunately, we actually have a few examples, not many, but a few examples of politicians who managed to go against that establishment perspective, right? Who said, no, I am going to stand for something. I am going to have a narrative about the future. Bernie Sanders in the United States, who ran in 2016 against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primaries, then again against Joe Biden in 2020, dropped out quite sooner. He actually not only provided a narrative about how to actually fix the West, or at least the United States, fix healthcare, tax the billionaire class, which seems like a very obvious thing to do for any equitable society, right? To decrease a little bit the huge income disparity that exists. He pushed a relatively radical narrative without falling into the ugliness of extreme right-wing populism, and he got an enormous wave of support, an enormous enthusiasm, an enthusiasm that is nowhere to be seen among establishment candidates, right? Maybe an enthusiasm that was a bit similar to Barack Obama in 2008, something like that. And in the UK, you have a similar example, without me particularly agreeing with everything that Jeremy Corbyn said. When he became Labour leader, I think it was in 2017, but correct me if I'm wrong, when he became Labour leader, 200,000 people signed up to be party members of the Labour Party. When he stopped being leader, Labour started losing those members again. There was an enormous wave of support for this. And Jeremy Corbyn won more votes in the last elections than Keir Starmer did in this year's elections, where he won the parliamentary elections. So essentially what we need to do is, without necessarily endorsing a specific candidate or a specific ideological agenda, we need to look at those leaders that manage to connect to people, that manage to connect with a wave of popular enthusiasm, where people again see some kind of hope and some kind of purpose to where we can go. And people like Corbyn, people like Bernie Sanders, and 2008 Barack Obama managed to actually do that. So that's the direction we have to go into. So the biggest step that we can take towards improving our system is that political parties stop being afraid of this identity politics, stop being afraid of tribalism, stop being afraid of hurting someone's feelings, just provide real answers. And then we can have a dialogue, and then liberal democracy can show its strength of real ideological clashes that lead to real solutions, that lead to real positive policy making with popular support from the population. That surely has to be the direction forward. And if the establishment continues doing what they do, then in the end, slowly over time, democracy will die.
This seems like a great moment to end this conversation on solutions for the Western bubble. If you have any questions, comments, or you heard a mistake that we've made throughout the episode, please make sure to send us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com, and we will incorporate them in our following episodes. This obviously also goes for any solutions you might have for the Western bubble. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next season in September when we burst the Western bubble. That is it from my side before the summer break. Balder, do you have any final words for the next 6 weeks without the Western bubble?
Nothing really, no quote today, just wishing everyone a wonderful summer, and try not to be offended so easily by people who are sometimes saying unkind things towards you. Brush them off and focus on the positives in life.